6 August 1944, Mortain, France. The morning air hung heavy with August heat and cordite, a gray film of dust drifting from the hedgerows as engines idled and flies worried the spent cases underfoot. From a low-rise east of town, Panzer crews of the 2 Panzer Division watched a Panther's 75mm L-70 strike an M4 Sherman square on the starboard sponson. The hit rang like a hammer on an iron cistern. Flame licked out, black smoke poured. Then, impossibly, the tank did not erupt. The turret hatch clanged open, men tumbled into the ditch coughing through sooty handkerchiefs, and the Sherman, staggering in gear, wheezed to a halt without the usual fireball. Warum brennen Sie nicht? One Oberleutnant was heard to mutter, baffled by the absence of the dreaded brew-up that had given the M4 its Tommy Cooker sneer since Tunisia. By noon, similar reports walked the radio net. Shells had found their mark, but crews lived. Stowage fires guttered instead of roaring. Secondary explosions came late or not at all. A Gefreiter later wrote that it felt like shooting at a stove with the door shut. The smoke was there, the heat was there, yet the thing refused to burst. Panther gunners recalculated ranges, loaders cursed, and field surgeons in American aid stations noticed something new. Burns, yes. Panic, less. The explanation was not a new armor plate or a factory miracle. It traced to a practical rethinking of where the Sherman carried. Its powder and how liquid and line could strangle a flame at birth, a fix first whispered. Months earlier among wrecks and workshops far from Normandy's hedgerows. To see how the smoke learned to die, we have to begin in North Africa, where desperation and a mechanic's hand drew the first crude diagram. November 1942. Tunisia. The desert air shimmered with heat and the smell of fuel. When the first American M4 Shermans rolled into battle near Tiburba, the Africa Corps learned something quickly. When you hit a Sherman, it burned. German gunners from the 15th Panzer Division called it the Christmas tank, because each impact lit up the sand like a festive torch. The Sherman's tall silhouette made it easy to spot against the flat dunes, and its gasoline engine gave every hit the volatility of a fuel dump. When an 80mm or even a Panzer WWII's short 75mm round punched through the armor, it often found the vertical ammunition racks lining the hull. Those shells ignited in a chain of explosions that sent turrets spinning into the air like bottle caps. Inside, the scene was hellish. Crews had seconds, no more, to scramble out through flames, smoke, and molten brass. Reports from the Tunisia front described tanks engulfed within 20 seconds of impact. Survivors told of comrades who never made it past the hatch. In some companies, 60% of knocked-out Shermans burned beyond recovery. American tankers, grimly joking, called their machines Ronsons, after the lighter that lights every time. Others preferred Zippo. At Aberdeen Proving Ground back in Maryland, ordnance officers collected the grim statistics and Gremier photographs. The numbers were undeniable. The M4, though powerful and easy to produce, was killing its crews faster than enemy fire alone. Yet wartime urgency demanded production, not redesign, and the Shermans kept rolling off assembly lines in Detroit and Lima by the thousands. Over 50,000 were planned. Stopping now was impossible. Somewhere between battlefield necessity and human survival, a solution would have to be found, not from blueprints, but from the men fighting inside the steel. June 12, 1944, a week after D-Day, Normandy was a graveyard of burned-out tanks and churned mud. In a rain-slick field outside St. Lo, Sergeant Edward Eddie Tiesenhausen of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division knelt beside yet another Sherman carcass, its hull split open like a tin can. The smell of scorched oil and cordite clung to everything. He'd serviced that tank the night before, checked its plugs, tightened its fan belt, and now its turret lay 30 yards away, blackened, its crew beyond saving. Eddie wasn't a designer, just a grease-stained mechanic who could rebuild an M4's transmission blindfolded. But he'd seen enough to understand what the engineers back home didn't. It wasn't German guns killing his men. It was the way their own tanks carried their ammunition. That night, under a makeshift canvas shelter, Tiesenhausen started sketching an idea in the margins of a field manual. What if the shells weren't stored along the sponsons, right where every side shot landed, but down low in the belly of the tank? And what if they were cooled, somehow, instead of sitting dry beside the fuel tanks? He scavenged what he could from wrecked vehicles: metal scrap, engine tubing, and the glycol coolant drained from disabled Shermans. Using these, he built crude water-jacketed boxes, sealing the shells inside and rerouting their storage to the floor. It was primitive field engineering, half luck, half stubborn genius, but it made sense. Cooler shells meant slower ignition, and lower placement meant fewer direct hits to the racks. Days later, a test Sherman took a Panther shell through the hull during a skirmish near Comont. The tank smoked but didn't explode. The crew crawled out alive, shaken but intact. Word spread fast. Maintenance units from the 2nd and 4th Armored Divisions came to see Eddie's trick, copying it with whatever scrap they could find. What began as one man's act of defiance against death was about to change the fate of an entire generation of tankers. July 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy hid more than infantry. Behind the front lines, in muddy workshops filled with the clatter of wrenches and the hiss of welding torches, American mechanics were rewriting the Sherman's design with whatever they had at hand. By now, field reports told the same story from every division. The tanks fitted with improvised coolant boxes and relocated ammunition racks weren't burning the way they used to. Crews were walking away from hits that once meant certain death. The 2nd Armored Division's maintenance logs spoke plainly. Significant reduction in post-penetration fires. Commanders noticed it too. Damaged tanks were no longer total losses. They were patched, repainted, and sent back into battle within days. When Colonel Joseph Colby, a veteran ordnance officer touring Normandy depots, arrived at one of these field workshops, he expected crude tinkering. Instead, he found ingenuity bordering on revolution. He examined Tiesenhausen's floor-stowed racks, the sealed boxes filled with glycol, and the hasty but effective rerouting of shell storage away from the sponsons. Colby ordered the setup photographed, measured, and documented for immediate transmission to Aberdeen Proving Ground. Within weeks, the fix became official. The U.S. Army formalized it under Technical Bulletin TB Ord 252, the new wet stowage system. The principle was simple but transformative. Move the ammunition down to the hull floor and surround it with sealed, water-filled jackets. Tests at Aberdeen confirmed what the soldiers already knew. Fires after penetration dropped by 3/4. The human cost was falling, and morale rose with it. By late summer, newly built M4A3 and M4A1 Shermans rolled off the line with the system installed from the start. And while the crews celebrated, on the other side of the front, German tankers began whispering among themselves. The Tommy cookers had stopped cooking. July 25, 1944. The fields west of St. Lo trembled as Operation Cobra began. Dawn broke beneath a haze of dust and exhaust, the air vibrating with the deep, rhythmic thunder of bombers softening the German lines. When the 3rd Armored Division advanced through the shattered hedgerows that morning, the crews carried with them something new. Not in their guns or armor, but buried deep inside their hulls. The 1st Shermans, fitted with the wet stowage modification, rolled into battle alongside older tanks, and the difference would be written in smoke, or rather, in the absence of it. Facing them was the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, hardened veterans who had watched hundreds of Allied tanks erupt in fireballs since Normandy began. Their Panther crews fired confidently, expecting the familiar spectacle, a flash, a jet of flame, the turret lifting from the hull. But that morning, something defied expectation. One German after-action note recorded it bluntly. Amerikanische Panzer sterben ohne zu brennen. American tanks die without burning. Panthers scored direct hits. Sherman stopped moving. But instead of fire, only white smoke drifted out as crewmen clambered free, coughing but alive. Reports from the 32nd Armored Regiment that day listed 18 tanks penetrated, yet only 4 caught fire, a survival ratio previously unthinkable. Lieutenant James Porter later wrote that it felt like the difference between being buried and walking away. Recovery teams were soon towing damaged tanks back to depots. repairing them within days instead of writing them off entirely. German intelligence units, intercepting American radio chatter, heard references to wet racks and assumed the Allies had developed new armor plating or chemical fire suppressants. They never guessed the truth. It was plumbing, not protection, that had rewritten the odds. The Shermans of St. Lo had proven it. Ingenuity could be as lethal as firepower. September 1944, Belgium, near Mons. The roads were lined with wrecks. Steel carcasses from the retreating German forces and the advancing Allies tangled together in the mud. Among them lay several Sherman tanks, burned, battered, but strangely intact inside. German engineers from the Panzer Commission arrived to investigate. Their orders were clear: recover, inspect, and understand why the American tanks were suddenly surviving hits that should have annihilated them. Under a gray sky and the scent of wet rust, they pried open the hulls of captured M4s and found something that defied logic. Inside the ammunition bins, instead of charred powder and shattered brass, there was water, or something like it, sloshing around steel boxes surrounding the shells. The discovery baffled them. Some engineers speculated that the Allies had begun using a fire-retardant chemical to sabotage German penetrations, or that these tanks carried a self-dousing mechanism to protect ammunition from ignition. One Wehrmacht intelligence circular, WWII, cautiously described a new American medium tank with submerged munition racks, significantly reducing internal combustion after penetration. The phrase internal combustion, once a death sentence for every Sherman crewman, was now being written. In the past tense, among the frontline soldiers, the effect was unmistakable. German tankers, especially those of Panzer Lehr and Das Reich, began to note in their diaries that enemy machines now withstand catastrophic ignition. The morale boost that came with watching a Sherman explode, the visible proof of superiority, was gone. Across the lines, the psychological balance shifted. Allied crews, knowing their odds of survival had doubled, began to press attacks more boldly. The simple field-borne fix had done more than keep the M4 alive. It had stripped away one of the last illusions of German dominance. The Sherman, once mocked as a torch, now refused to burn. Autumn 1944. The industrial heart of America roared without pause. In Michigan, the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant and the Fisher Tank Division received new blueprints marked with a single letter that meant survival, W for wet stowage. Within days, engineers and line workers retooled assembly jigs and welding sequences to accommodate the redesigned ammunition bays. What had begun as a field improvisation in the mud of Normandy now shaped the rhythm of the Detroit production lines. Each new M4A375W and M4A376W rolled out of the plants with sealed water glycol jackets encasing the ammunition, a quiet revolution hidden beneath layers of steel and paint. The system used about 30 gallons of a water glycol mixture circulating around each shell rack. Maintained under slight pressure, it absorbed heat and quenched sparks before they could trigger combustion. The redesign reduced the Sherman's ammunition load from 97 to 71 rounds, but the trade was priceless. Crews who once joked about their tanks being rolling coffins now had reason to believe they might live through a direct hit. Across Europe, logistics officers coordinated a retrofitting surge. Field depots from Cherbourg to Liège received modification kits, while the Quartermaster Corps added drums of coolant to their supply convoys alongside rations and gasoline. By December 1944, more than 2,000 Shermans in theater had been upgraded, their new plumbing becoming as vital as their armor. It was a triumph of industrial flexibility and human ingenuity, an army adapting not by invention alone, but by listening to the battlefield. Yet the ultimate test of this system would come soon, amid the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where fire and steel would decide whether wet stowage truly worked when it mattered most. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried under snow and silence until the German guns broke it open. Operation Wacht am Rhein thundered westward in the last desperate gamble of the Third Reich. From Bastogne to Houffalize, American tank crews found themselves ambushed in narrow roads and frozen valleys, facing Panthers and Tigers in blizzards of fire. Yet this time, something was different. The new Shermans, the M4A3, 75W, and 76W models with wet stowage, rolled into combat not as fire traps, but as fighters that could take a hit and keep their crews alive. At Bastogne, Sergeant Harold Klein's tank from the 10th Armored Division met a German Pak-40 head-on. 2 shells smashed through the side armor, flooding the compartment with smoke and sparks. For a few seconds, the crew braced for the inevitable inferno, but the flames sputtered, hissed against the glycol, and died. Klein's loader suffered burns, but the ammunition stayed silent. They bailed out into the snow, shaken, alive, and swearing they'd just seen a miracle made of plumbing. Across the sector, field reports echoed the same refrain. Penetrations, but no detonations. The 4th Armored Division compiled the numbers later. Of all Shermans hit during the bulge, nearly 78% of crews survived. What had once been the war's deadliest seat now gave men a fighting chance. German officers interrogating captured Americans refused to believe the answer was water. Wasser? One incredulous Oberst reportedly muttered, shaking his head. But the proof lay on the battlefield. Charred Panthers, their fuel tanks erupted, lay beside scorched but intact Shermans whose crews were already back in new tanks. In that frozen crucible, the wet stowage system earned its final validation. A mechanic's improvisation, forged in Normandy's mud, had conquered the fire of the Ardennes. War had always been a contest of steel and numbers, but inside a Sherman, survival once depended on luck and seconds. Before the arrival of wet stowage, tank crews lived with a grim acceptance that one solid hit could turn their world into a furnace. Veterans of North Africa and Normandy carried burn scars as proof of how thin the margin between courage and catastrophe truly was. Yet by early 1945, that fatalism began to fade. The new Shermans with the W stamped beside their serials brought something intangible but priceless: confidence. Crews started calling them Wet Willies, a name spoken half in jest, half in reverence for the design that finally gave them a fighting chance. In training camps across England and France, instruction reels now highlighted the safety of the new system. Recruiters noticed it too. Volunteers for armored units began to rise. Letters sent home by tankers changed in tone. Gone were the fearful confessions of men expecting to die in their machines. In their place came accounts of endurance, of trust in their tanks, and pride in the ingenuity that protected them. The battlefield itself reflected the shift. German prisoners complained that the enemy's machines will not die properly. A grudging acknowledgement that the psychological edge had changed sides. What had started as a crude field modification had become more than hardware. It was a statement of faith in problem-solving, in the idea that even in the chaos of war, human inventiveness could outthink destruction. The wet rack was a triumph not just of metal and water, but of morale, proof that American adaptability could turn survival itself into a weapon. By early 1945, as Allied columns punched through the Siegfried Line and poured into Germany, the change in how American tankers fought was unmistakable. The wet stowage Shermans had transformed the psychology of armored warfare. Gone was the hesitancy that once kept crews behind cover, fearful of any side hit that could turn their tank into a coffin. Now commanders maneuvered boldly. The 9th Armored Division's reports from the Remagen bridgehead recorded Shermans charging through anti-tank fire to secure crossings, their crews trusting that even a penetration no longer meant instant death. Crew losses substantially reduced even under sustained engagement, the report noted, a phrase that marked a quiet revolution in doctrine. Instead of avoiding duels, Sherman units began to use speed and aggression as their armor. Wet stowage had not made them invincible, but it had given them something equally vital: time. A tank that didn't erupt in flames could be recovered, repaired, and redeployed within days. German gunners who once relied on the terror of seeing a Sherman ignite now faced opponents willing to fight closer and longer. The Wehrmacht's psychological edge, that grim certainty that every hit would light the horizon, had vanished. The armored board at Fort Knox would later conclude that crew confidence directly correlates to vehicle recoverability and post-hit survival. The insight reshaped Allied tactics, maneuver, and endurance over brute armor. The Sherman still couldn't match a Tiger's gun, but it could outlast it, hit, repair, return, and fight again. The field fix that began as one mechanic's improvisation had rewritten not just the tank's design, but the mindset of those who fought inside it. From that point onward, the U.S. Army began to see survival itself as a weapon. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department turned from fighting to measuring. In laboratories and archives, engineers compared the grim arithmetic of tank warfare, crew losses, vehicle recoveries, and fire incidents from the deserts of 1942 to the forests of 1945. The results were irrefutable. Wet stowage had reduced catastrophic burn deaths by nearly 80%. What began as an improvised field modification had evolved into a new design philosophy: survival through isolation. Ammunition, once stored wherever space allowed, would now be shielded, cooled, or vented away from the men it could destroy. The lesson carried forward into the next generation of tanks. The M26 Pershing, arriving too late to change the war but early enough to inherit its lessons, featured separated ammunition racks and improved fire suppression. By the 1950s, the M48 Patton introduced armored bins and blow-off panels, safety measures that deliberately directed explosions outward instead of inward. Even Soviet designers analyzing captured Western vehicles recognized the idea's brilliance. They began incorporating their own variations of crew compartment isolation, a tacit acknowledgement that survivability was now as vital as firepower. Years later, an ordnance historian rediscovered a faded field log labeled Tiesenhausen, 3rd Armored Maintenance. Its pages were smudged with oil and grease, scrawled with sketches of pipes and notes about coolant flow. It wasn't a blueprint, it was a mechanic's diary. Yet from those rough drawings had come a revolution that reached every armored corps on Earth. The war that had consumed millions left few legacies of mercy, but one of them was forged by a man who refused to accept that his friends should burn alive inside their machines. In the end, Sergeant Edward Eddie Tiesenhausen's story was never truly about machinery. It was about defiance, the quiet, stubborn refusal to accept that death inside a burning tank was simply part of war. Among the blackened carcasses of Shermans scattered across Normandy, one man's refusal to look away became the difference between survival and annihilation for hundreds of others. His name appeared on no citation, his invention on no patent. Official histories credited the wet stowage system to ordnance engineers in distant offices. Yet for the men who lived through the blinding flash of impact and realized, with disbelief, that they were still breathing, the credit belonged to someone else, the nameless mechanic who had refused to watch them burn. Years later, veterans would speak of those moments, the shells slamming home, the heat rushing through the hull, and then silence. No roar, no fireball, only the stunned quiet of life continuing where it should have ended. In that fragile pause lay the victory of human thought over inevitability, proof that intellect could outfight destruction. From the ashes of burned tanks rose an unseen revolution, carried not by generals or designers, but by one man's grease-stained conviction that survival was worth fighting for. Every time a Sherman took a hit and did not ignite, his idea was there, cooling death with water in the dark.